Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's coffee chat. My name's Martin Simpson. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at Preservica. My background is not only in information security, but also in governance, legal, regulatory compliance, as well as a background in traditional IT and systems maintenance. I'm delighted to be joined today by Michael, CEO of Gravity Union. Gravity Union is a Canadian-based consultancy firm with expertise in information governance and records management. They are particularly knowledgeable about all things Microsoft 365. Therefore, they're an important partner to us and a reseller of our Preserve 365 product. Michael, why don't you go ahead and reintroduce yourself?
Thanks, Martin. We pretty much turned 10 years old, I think, last week as an organization, and we're just really passionate about working with organizations and helping them implement Microsoft 365 properly. I'd argue that most people we talk to will typically rush your implementation, and they find it difficult to do things like records management or sensitivity or compliance or digital archiving as well. So we're really gung-ho about making sure they do things right to get value out of the platform.
Great. So we're here today, obviously, to talk about digital preservation. I know that when I started in this industry, it was a new term to me, and it may be new to some of our listeners. So I think it's best if I kind of frame that up first, the definition, and make sure we're all in alignment with that. So digital preservation to us is the active ongoing process of managing born digital and digitalized materials to ensure they remain accessible and readable for future generations, overcoming what is normally costly file format and software obsolescence issues. It's particularly important for, of course, your CISO, CTOs, CIOs that are managing organizations with high value content that must be kept for periods usually for longer than like 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years. The example that I like to reference, because I'm just about old enough to remember, is Microsoft Word Perfect, right? It's old software. There are still law firms out there that have Word Perfect files, and those are probably not readable in today's format, right? Our software can take those files and actively digitally preserve them by maybe creating copies that are PDF or Microsoft Word docx format, making sure that they're still discoverable and readable way into the future. It doesn't matter if Microsoft Word becomes the next Word Perfect, right? Our software will continue to create accessible copies. And when we talk about Office 365, that's where a lot of those digital contents exist today. We want to make sure that we can get those files into the platform and continue to preserve them for 10, 20, 30, even longer, as we go into the future. And I think that's why, the relationship between Preservica and Gravity Union is so important. We're a market leader in preservation, and we're pleased to obviously have Preserve 365. Whereas, as you explained, Michael, you being very focused and versed in Microsoft 365 as a platform means that we can work together with customers to make sure we're maintaining that preservation. Kind of makes sense to you, that definition?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'm going to totally I'll tangent to that. Maybe talk about the term archiving. There's lots of tools and technologies out there that have the word archive attached to them, and I've pressed the term into service, and just in the mere simply moving things out of the way or taking a backup of that content, and then digital preservation or archiving, I think, are often they're synonyms of each other to a degree. And whenever I'm in a meeting with an actual archivist, I get my hand slapped because they say that's not just taking a backup of it, isn't archiving it. And it's this notion of how do we get it into this format whereby we can have longevity of the format of the content, so we can reference it in 100 years if we need to be. So yeah, maybe demystify a little bit of that just simply like M365 archive is not doing digital preservation in the same sense that you guys are. So maybe I know, Martin, if you want to dig into that a little bit as well, your perception of that, the mixing of those terms.
Yeah, I hear it a lot, right? I have a tool that archives files and copies them off to a hard drive. Maybe you store it in a safe or something like that. And, that's true if we're only talking about traditional archiving or just being able to create copies of those files. Digital preservation is all about making sure that you can actually read those files in many, many years' time. No matter what happens with Adobe Reader standards or PDF standards, right? Those change seemingly every year at the moment. I don't know what version of the PDF specification we're on, but it's certainly not one format as most people think. So, you might not be able to read those files. Sure, you've got them locked away on a drive, and digital preservation is about making them readable in the future.
And even though it's a good point, Martin. So that even that time frame, we were doing a big migration from their platform, and even like JPEG formats. The new system wasn't able to open these old JPEGs that were split out into TIFF files and so on and so forth. I won't get into too much detail, but this was an order of time frame of like 10 or 15 years, not 50 or 100, but in a relatively short time frame, we've had technologies become obsolete, unable to open that content and read and reference it. So all the more importance to get this figured out.
That's a great segue. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your kind of typical customers that you work with? What are the kind of risks that your customers are seeing, and pain points that you're trying to solve?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess big picture, we're usually coming to organizations that either have a messy, Microsoft 365 implementation, or they're on a legacy system, or they're on network file storage, and they're wanting to move into Microsoft 365 in a very thoughtful manner. And I guess from our standpoint, why we love the whole notion of archiving is on a couple reasons beyond just simply the act of digital preservation. So we're a records management focused organizations. Most of our clients need to put this preservation and this lock on their content for a fairly long time. And these are often really important, vital records for the organization that they're going to need to open up with 100 years from now, so on and so forth. And when they were in paper format, that wasn't a problem, although we had this risk of fires or floods. But now in digital format, you really do run the risk of not being able to open up these vital, critical records, 10, 15, 20 years out in the future. So it's critical for us to have this story complete in the platform. But I think there's a ton of value just beyond that digital preservation aspect. And what I love about it is a couple of things. So one is we get to move content out of SharePoint that people don't need on a regular basis. And we get a ton of benefit from that on what we can dive into. So one is if we have a large volume of content, let's say we're dealing with like tens of thousands of documents that are coming to our system, invoices or whatever happens to be, on a regular basis, you will eventually sort of effectively fill up the document library in SharePoint. They do have a limit of I think 30 million documents into one library, but effectively over 100,000 documents, you run into problems with security and so on and so forth. And so you like to keep it down to sort of the tens of thousands. And if you can think of having this constant outflow of content from an invoices library, where we're constantly moving things back to an archival digital preservation area and moving it out of SharePoint, just like in the paper world when we had, I might have a binder behind me of the current year's invoices and maybe last year's invoices, but after 3 years, the odds of me needing to check an invoice diminishes and falls off a bit of a cliff. And so we put those into a box and we put them down and we move them out of the way. And so the same thing is true in the digital world, where it's nice when we're able to move that content that's not really needed out of the way and keep our SharePoint implementation nice and clean and hygienic. That improves our search results. It improves the search. If you have to re-index your entire SharePoint environment, that'll be quicker, easier to navigate. They can, of course, go and search and find the digital archive stuff in Preservica as well. But that's the thing that. And then we talk about artificial intelligence. The old adage that we all learned 25 years ago, or at least I did, garbage in, garbage out. And so if we have a bunch of really old documents that we need to hold on to for records management purposes, but you don't necessarily want that being fed into your RAG that gets sent back to the LLM to produce and do some of the content generation from an AI perspective. So it's nice to keep that nice SharePoint site hygienic, nice and clean. And you also have storage costs. We have lots of enterprise clients that are hitting those thresholds within their tenant, and they have to move either use M365 archive just to move out of the way, or start deleting stuff or using retention to get rid of it. But it's nice to be able to have other tools and options that are perhaps a better long-term strategy.
And you're kind of touching there on SharePoint hygiene and SharePoint sprawl. In my former life as an IT manager, right, SharePoint sites would pop up all over the place, and you wouldn't really know what's in them. And different teams have different processes. So, setting up those guidelines around what needs to be stored in immediate access type SharePoint type environments versus what can be archived off. Of course, with Preservica, it is online, right? You are taking out of SharePoint, but you can still access it in a much more ready way, but without those expensive costs and, inflating your SharePoint environment and ending up with this hugely unwieldy environment. So yeah, SharePoint sprawl, SharePoint hygiene. I know there's a topic close to your heart as well.
Yeah, and it's nice because you basically you're putting it in this sort of final resting place, in a trusted final resting place, and it can just live there until it's just not needed, which could be a far distant point in the future. Yeah.
So I'm guessing you're trying to guide customers on the safe place to store these things. Yes, SharePoint is, I assume, relatively safe, but that final resting place is just as important. So kind of what is the story that you're telling customers about that long-term lifespan of a digital asset and the kind of recommendations you have?
Yeah, well, SharePoint is only as secure as you configure it. But by default, it's a pretty secure platform, and obviously has enterprise secure features, and is being used by all kinds of militaries and police forces and so on and so forth around the world. For the longest time, a lot of records management systems were simply underused, and so what we encourage our users to think about is just not what do we have right now, especially from a record standpoint. You want to have a content born in one location, live out its collaboration lifecycle in that location, and then typically we have this semi-active stage, and that's when we actually would probably encourage our clients to, like, let's think about, well, what are we doing with this semi-active stage? Where's it going? That typically in the paper world, that used to mean we're sending it to the basement in a box. So in digital, it's like, well, can we get rid of it at this point? Does it make sense? But and then a little even perhaps beyond that, where we have these indefinite records and so on and so forth. So we love this story or this narrative of really thinking about the journey of this content from its inception, its birth, through its collaboration window, through it's an active record that people need to reference to make decisions based off of, through this semi-active stage, maybe it's less important, and then what's beyond that, and in many cases too, we have so many clients who have a file plan that says, at the end of this term, we need to pass it off to a federal or provincial or state level government, and there's just transfer of records that go to these other organizations. And in many cases, those parent, whatever the relationship is, they're actually not set up yet to take that content. And we know in many cases there's 10 or 20 or 30-year delay. And so what do you do with that content in the meantime? And how do you ensure that you're still going to be able to deliver that content to the organizations? And we really have to make sure that that content's going to be readable in 50 years or 100 years to make sure that we're fulfilling our purpose as a records management function within organizations. So.
And I wonder how many customers are really thinking about that kind of long-term life, right? Are they considering the risks around not being able to access data, the impact on maybe their regulatory or legal compliances?
I think we're starting to hit a bit of at least what I'm seeing is we're seeing a bit of a pivotal point in the industry now. A lot of people have moved on to SharePoint and Microsoft 365, and their tenants are full. And they're like, well, how do we get rid of this? And there's a couple obvious ones. And one is records management. And so, okay, well, let's go take that content and slice and dice it. And the second one, I think that a lot of people are coming around to, is the fact that, well, we need to figure out this digital preservation and archiving, because we can't just keep on putting stuff into our SharePoint site forever and ever. And we need to make sure that we can open these things in 100 years. And I think people are also starting to appreciate just how fast the pace of technology is changing. Like, I used to complain 10 years ago, oh, it's changing too fast. And now in the past, like 6 months with AI and all these tools coming out, it's a much more chaotic environment. So I think people really are truly appreciating more and more the need to wrangle the complete life cycle of their content.
Maybe you can share an example, anonymous or fictitious, or otherwise, like where inadequate digital preservation could lead to more serious business or compliance issues.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, there are many, contracts, master services agreements and contracts that are put in place and will have a longevity of, 25, 30, 40 years without being renewed. Whether or not they should have been would be the question. But we do know that we have clients that have had contracts, and then, we write our contracts to figure out what we do in cases where we have a major disagreement. And we know of cases where The contract was fairly old. It was migrated from an old system. It had there were JPEGs of signatures and stuff like that, and the contract became unreadable. And essentially, when you take that to your courts, it gets thrown out. It doesn't the document doesn't render. And so yeah, it can be a huge ramification there in terms of being able to do that. So yeah.
And I think from my side as a CISO, right, I'm always thinking about the security of these solutions. And, I trust Microsoft, like I'm sure most people do, or at least to the extent that you can. I want to store my files in SharePoint. I fully appreciate that customers who are potentially looking at services like Preserve 365 via you as a partner, want to make sure that Preservica is storing it equally as secure, right? You want to make sure that those records are will not be modified. That we're doing things like checksums and hashes to make sure that it is truly the original file that's being retained. Because exactly the point you said, when this comes, hopefully it never goes to court. But if that document does need to be reproduced and it's moved from system to system to system, you may well need to prove that that file has not been modified in those transactions. And that's something that I think about a lot, because really maintaining that data integrity is vitally important. And that's why we went ahead and created this mechanism, Preserve 365, to transfer files in a way that we can guarantee, to the extent that someone can over the internet, keep those files in an integral way and make sure that we're storing them as they were in the system. Maybe you can talk about kind of data integrity risks in organizations as a general principle.
I think more of the story is having the single source of truth and understanding where that content is. And again, the more organized you are and the more automated we can be with that, then we can, at some point, when it doesn't need to be in SharePoint anymore, we can move it out of it automatically for end users. You can, obviously, Preservica has the functionality to do this, but it's nice to take those mundane tasks off of the plates of end users, automate those processes for them, so they can focus on their day job. But yeah, obviously, the integrity is critical, and just as you may have an invalid format, we've all run into corrupted files. A big Excel file that we've been using for months and months and doing a bunch of financial stuff on, and it gets corrupted. So making sure that we avoid those kinds of pitfalls as well, which can happen in SharePoint. So
I think that's great, and that kind of leads me on to what would an integration with Preserve 365 look like as a kind of recommendation to you, to customers. You walk into a customer's site, maybe they've got that sprawling SharePoint environment you've just spoken about, all these SharePoint Frankensites, as you kind of referred to it. How would you kind of go about recommending Preserve 365 and integrating that into an overall data program for them?
It's actually twofold. So oftentimes when we're going to organizations, they have a bit of a mess. And one of the first things that we can do, and it's what I do love about Preservica, it is quite easy to, in bulk, move lots of stuff out of the way. And so oftentimes what we typically do is we come in and let's get Preservica turned on, and then let's just identify all the content, even the stuff that we're not even totally sure, but let's just move it out of the way. We know it's important. We can deal with that later. But when we go to redesign our SharePoint environment to take into account scalability and security, records management, digital archiving, so on and so forth, it's nice to start off with a smaller corpus of content to work with. So we're not trying to restructure, redesign, and migrate a bunch of content. So it is nice to be able to move stuff out of the way. That's sort of step one. And then, going back and trying to, as much as we can, create this environment that really focuses on supporting how people work. I'm trying to bring back that 90s business term synergy, Martin, where the more that we focus on a great end user experience, the easier digital preservation, records management, privacy, sensitivity, security becomes, because you have that structure and you have that detail. So again, we love this notion of focusing on a great user experience and this end-to-end journey of the single source of truth content.
And I guess lastly, just in more general, how do you think Gravity Union can help customers like listening to this today evaluate their records management program to understand if they actually have a gap and therefore would benefit from digital preservation?
So yeah, we come in and we just help you. SharePoint is very much like Lego. I've often been quoted saying, and there's an infinite ways that we can put those pieces together. But there's also a handful of ways that are going to be appropriate for that organization, taking into account their culture, their capacity, their budgets, and so on and so forth. And then still further still, just like on that math multiple choice exam, there's multiple correct answers. But we're ideally shooting for this one perfect answer where, again, we take that content from its inception, it has a home place of well-being for collaboration. We automate the process of records management to compliance. And then on the back end of that records piece, there's that transition to digital archiving. And there's this constant flow of content into the solution and back out of the solution into Preservica for digital archiving or through a destruction process on the record side. And again, it really simplifies your maintenance, your management, and your costs from SharePoint perspective. So that's really where we come in and we can help.
This is great, Michael. If customers or people here listening want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with Gravity Union?
Contact@gravityunion.com. We have a direct one, or they can email me at mschweitzer@gravityunion.com if you can figure out how to spell my last name. Hopefully it'll be there on the thing. But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, I think that's all the time we got for today. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I obviously love chatting to you, Michael, anyway. Thank you for yourself and the Gravity Union team for today's session. Really look forward to continuing working with you. And if anyone has any questions, they can be funneled through to us, and I'm sure we'll try and get back to them. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Have a good day. Take care.
Thanks.